Whitsun 880. As Father Baker left the church at Winchester that evening, our letter was pushed into his hand. Frowning in the candlelight, he strode out onto Winchester's High Street, the evening's sun's rays illuminating the yellowing sheet, looking over the letters once, and then once again. "Good evening, Baker." Uhtred Ragnarsson's voice carried through the mellow air. He strode over to Priest, who looked up from the missive. Baker looked up, his face alight with happiness as he read the letter once more. "Something pleases you?" Uhtred prompted, glancing between the priest and the letter in his hands. "Uhtred." Baker snapped his head up, looking at the warrior almost as if he were a stranger. "Uhtred," he repeated, more softly. "I went to see Alfred, as you suggested." Uhtred held his jaw, then shook his head. "I'm heading north, Father. I mean, Bryder's gone with Ragnar. I feel Northumbria calling me." "Do not tell me your gods call you," Baker scorned. "Bibbenberg calls me, and Dunham and Deofowick." "So," he said, looking back at Baker's letter. "What makes you look as if you have spent a year in a brothel?" Baker gave him a deep frown. "News." "Good news?" Uhtred pressed. Baker looked back to the letter once more. "Good news, Uhtred, or at least, I think it's good news. Now," he clipped, changing the subject before Uhtred could push it further, "if you are intent in going north, you should ensure someone responsible accompanies you." 88,888,888. "Why did you bring the child?" It had been 3 days since the battle at Strathaearn, 3 days since the Norse, repelled by a coordinated attack by Flansinna and the Uineel allies, had been forced to leave Irion, had mounted an attack, first at Eochaid's capital in the green hollow of Cathars, then, pushing east, ravaged villages in Strathclyde and in Pitland. The kin of Ivar had been vicious. Strathclyde had lost hundreds, and a similar number of Pictish warriors were left beside the river. But they had done it. Norse did not occupy Alba, did not subdue it or terrify its people. Instead, they had pushed south, into lawless, ungoverned Northumbria, and had subdued, terrified and occupied that kingdom's lands instead. Constantine had returned, injured but victorious. A great feast had been held, exalting the Picts and Gaels, and their Strathclyde cousins. Constantine had then proclaimed them as one kingdom, called Alba, who had been attacked by the Norse, but had also been divided from Irion. I pressed that Flansinna should reconsider, that the Norse should attack our country. Osrith had watched from outside the main hall doors as Constantine had walked around his guests, all but declaring treachery of his Aryan kin. More will come. But, united, we are strong. Strathaearn has proved this. So, he had stood before the throne, holding aloft his arms. I declare the country of Alba united. In the banqueting hall, all of the nobles were seated, with their households, with their lords. Constantine spoke to them all, spoke for them all. It was a master stroke of genius, all Alba kingdoms combined under one, much like the High King of the Irish, who had, inadvertently, brought Constantine into an equivalent position here. Even those who had fought with Giric against Domnall at Scone, who had cursed the Alpin name as they mourned the man they called Lord, were applauding with hearty approval and unalloyed loyalty. It would seem that, on the anvil of invasion, as with Alfred, of subsumption by the Norse, as had been with the Danes in the south, had annealed a nation. A huge cheer had arisen, and the king had continued, "How we are in the defense of our realm, so we will be in faith. Bishop Selach works with me in this, for all the people of Alba." The applause, remembered now in Osrith's mind, died away as Constantine's question filled the room. "Because I can have none of my own. And, out of choice, the choice of seeing a child live when so many have died." Osrith put her hand to her stomach. That first time, in the Scrubland of Doia, where her body had expelled the first child, many more followed. She had used the route too many times, hadn't Betha, the heathen healer, told her as much? It was not often that the king asked for her company. In truth, after she had arrived, on that cold, rainy October night nearly 3 years before, he had sought out her company often. But, with her consistent rejection of his bodily advances, Era had replaced her in Constantine's affection. as was right. Osrith did not know quite had brought him to bring Edra to his room that night, but her sleeping form seemed to bring him a sense of peace, the same peace Osrith had once brought him as a frightened, unhappy child. "I am sorry for your losses," Constantine said, and leaned across the child, taking Osrith's hand. Osrith closed her eyes, the weight of her own lack of concern for these losses pressing down on her as the king sought her breast. It was strange sort of comfort he gained from this, Osrith knew, but still, she shook him off. He sought her hand again. "When is it you wish me to leave?" she asked, changing the subject. "Not yet. The Norse grow too restless, they began to fight one another. My uncle Flano is uncompromising in his dedication in eradicating them from Arion. More will follow the grandsons of Ivar." "Yes," mused Osrith, staring upwards, into the darkness. Flansinna was most inflexible in his attitude to ruling. Perhaps that was what the land needed. Arion was altogether different to Alba, Welles or any of the Saxon kingdoms. Flansinna should be applauded. "The Norse he expels come here still. Already this day, they have ravaged the fortress at Dunkeld, where the relics of Saint Comsil rest. Or, maybe by now, rested." The king sighed, a breath of frustration. Osrith knew, not resignation. "They take the farmlands around the Tay. They have no wish to move on. And Eochaid calls for help, after everything." Then his voice dropped lower. "Yet it is not Eochaid, it is Owain. Ragnar has invaded his lands since we expelled them, since Ethelfled has given them the Wirral," Osrith said, blandly, fighting away her instinct towards that abhorrent girl. "Ethelred has an unknown illness. She is in command." "You have done well, Osrith Lackland, and you have not even left Alba yet." Constantine moved his hand and began to stroke Edra's hair. "I have more campaigning to do. You will be required to leave should I need information. What I really need is a long-term field agent, and you will be of no use if your mind is on Edra." The girl lying between them sighed in her sleep. If someone were to have glanced at the three of them, they would be forgiven for thinking they were daughter, husband and wife. "There is no great hurry yet. I fear Ethelfled's plan will be her undoing. Norse do not just accept land, they fight to take more." "What cities are near the Wirral?" "Chester," Osrith whispered. "It is a fine walled city once belonging to the Romans." "My guess," Constantine murmured, "is that they will take this city and try to hold it as a staging post so more Norse can come freely from Arion." "And you wish I should leave then?" There was a softness in her now, Osrith thought bitterly. She would never have returned here willingly. Her uncle was still alive, even now, and even now Constantine could propose a trade deal with her for more land. Whatever use she still might be. Little, she hoped. But the little girl, hair the same color as her mother's, bright orange gold, like a bright flame, bright blue eyes, those of her father, Bilka's eyes, had chosen for her. Osrith pictured little Edra's face, soft, like all young children, but was her mother's, angular, strong, like a fox, waiting and watching. Yet, her first words had not Danish, nor yet Saxon, but Gaelish, like Constantine. Indeed, Osrith could hear her intimation, calling her Mathair and Constantine Athair, as he had always insisted she should. Edra would put a thumb to her mouth, saying, Bain and Aran, just as Aga would. Allah, the heathen in Winchester who had saved her life when Thyra was dying, had warned she had a strong connection to her mother, but Osrith could not speak Danish, nor yet entreat that she should teach her to be a pagan. But, of course, Thyra had been baptized and was an active part next to Boka. There was a part of her that meant that leaving her gods and turning to God, closed the door on the horror she had suffered under Sven and Kjartan's hands at Dunham. You should teach her father's language, Constantine said, again stroking Edra's hair as she slept. Osrith smiled, she had never seen the king be so tender towards his own children. Yes, Osrith nodded. She must learn English. Ingles. Aye. Bilka is not Saxon, I will teach her. Yet, it always feels strange to speak it here. Take her to Chaldees, the Lindisfarne monks speak it there. Endolf will accompany me, so he will not need your sword training. Over the water? Yes. Osrith nodded, then shuddered as Constantine trailed his hand over the form of her breasts again. Why tormenting her, mind and body? Did he not care that, though she would travel by boat to the monastery across the river, she hated to? You cannot forget him? He stopped moving his hand, but did not withdraw it. He who it is you love with passion? In her head, Osrith saw Finan, the only man who had ever made her feel love, rather than just do love. Well, the second. But, Saenid, too, invaded her thoughts but, to Osrith, the head of the palace guard felt more like a father to her than the lover she knew he wanted to be to her. Her mind pushed Saenid away and her mind filled with Finan again, his breath on her face, his body on hers causing her to sigh and gasp. His hands holding her body, making her feel protected and safe. She could feel like she might have been if she could have been Edra again. Edra of Bibbenberg, with her man, Finan the Agile. No one else had ever made her feel like he had. He could hold her even for a second, and it was just him and her, just the two of them in the whole world. He's probably dead, Osrith said, dismissively. This happens when you associate with my brother. Then, that is settled, Constantine murmured, still touching Osrith's body, his hand moving between the folds of her tunic and onto her bare skin. I am leaving in the morning, to Skon, to plan our defenses against the Norse, and to begin the church reform needed for Alba. You will stay here, you will educate Edra. He withdrew his arm and began to sit up. I will. Then, another face invaded her mind. Domhnall would not have concerned himself with matters of the church. Relics and ritual meant nothing to him. At that moment, Constantine felt more of a king to his people, both a warrior in body and for their spiritual concerns than ever his cousin did. Malcolm, Domhnall's son, was likely to be king after Constantine, with little Indolf following after, as was the Gaelish custom. If the footprint at Dund was Constantine's, Malcolm would have a big void to fill. Then, as Osrith began to relax, as Constantine rose to his feet, the king of Alba asked, Abla Thursday Jalagamort? Thajalagamort faithest, Osrith whispered, taking Constantine's hand. Aguspithiguberat. With her confirmation reaffirmed, Constantine got up from his bed very carefully, tush-tushing Edra sothingly before leaving them both to sleep.